Hello. This is a talk recorded for the Kirkintilloch District Society of Antiquaries. My name is Nina Baker, and I am an independent engineering historian with particular interest in the histories of women in science and engineering. And this talk is about women in Scotland working in various forms of engineering, mainly in the 20th century. I do this because I think that it's not sufficiently widely known that women have been doing engineering work, and not just during munitions work during the two world wars, and also quite a long time ago, not just the recent decades of women getting more recent opportunities. So I'm now going to share my PowerPoint, which means that there'll be a couple of me faffing around getting this to share screen. So here is my starting slide. This shows an exhibition that was put on to demonstrate women's work at what was then known as Ferranti's in Edinburgh, now known as Leonardo's, which is a defence electronics company, and is one of the sectors in which women have always done engineering work from almost the invention of defence electronics. So to go back a bit, in order to become an engineer, you have to have a certain level of education. And it was really not until the late part of the 19th century that girls in Scotland could get anything resembling a decent education at all. And even then, most of the secondary school education was privately provided, paid for education for the middle classes and upper class girls. This image is actually of a school in London. It's the science laboratory at Bedford High School for girls in about 1902. But some of the better schools in the cities of Scotland, in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the better private schools for girls would have had basic chemistry laboratories, maybe possibly physics, probably biology. But most girls didn't get a science education, so that made it very difficult for them then to go on and do things resembling engineering, perhaps at college or university. And it was, of course, quite a while before girls could even go to university, that the admission of women into the Scottish universities, the ancient universities, didn't happen until about 1892. And most of the girls going to the universities then would have been hoping to be either doctors, medical doctors, or possibly school teachers. And some of them might have taken science subjects, but in the early part of the 20th century, actually degrees were either a BA, a general humanities degree, or a BSc, a general sciences degree. And it wouldn't have been until the 1920s or thereabouts that degrees were even described as being engineering as such. But quite a lot of women took degrees that included a high proportion of things like mechanics and electricity and magnetism, engineering type subjects. Here are some of the dates associated with the main Scottish universities at the time. You'll see that there's quite a disparity in the dates when women are thought to have been the first female engineering graduate at different universities. Here are some pictures of some of the women that we know from the university records did graduate in various sorts of engineering from the Scottish universities. Some of these have become fairly well known now, others less so. So Molly Ferguson, the top row, Molly Ferguson, we'll come back to her. She was a civil engineer. Maria Watkins, also civil engineer. Elizabeth Georgeson Um, she was more on the mathematics side, but she did do some engineering. Anne Shaw is an interesting example because she didn't actually do engineering at university. She did what we'd call industrial psychology, but she went on to become the leading British production efficiency type engineer. She was the British expert in motion studies during the middle of the 20th century. In the bottom row, Dorothy Buchanan was the first woman to get a civil engineering degree in Scotland. Lesley Suter was the first woman to get an electrical engineering degree. Elizabeth Lindsay was one of the earliest women at Edinburgh to get a university degree in engineering. And Dorothy Rowntree was the first woman by some decades to get a degree in naval architecture. And she worked briefly with her father, who was a Lloyd's surveyor of shipping. Many of the other names of the early women who got engineering degrees in the box on the right-hand side, we know nothing else about. We've not been able to track any significant information about them. So there's always more to know on this. So here are some Scottish engineers you may have heard of, perhaps. Dorothy Pullinger, and we'll come back to all of these. Dorothy Pullinger, automobile engineer. Molly Ferguson, I mentioned already, civil engineer, and Victoria Drummond, a ship's engineer. So starting with Victoria Drummond, now this is an example of a woman who never went to university. She would have attended night school when she was an apprentice, but she was somebody who got all her training in the absolutely traditional way of going to a shipyard and being a shipyard apprentice and learning about marine engineering that way. And the picture on the left is her in her apprentice's outfit. This is a picture from the Woman Engineer, which is the magazine of the Women's Engineering Society, which she was a very early member of. And the pictures on the right are of the Caledon shipyard in Dundee, where she did her apprenticeship from 1918 to 1922. And that was indeed, and until quite recently, that was the standard way for anybody who wanted to become a ship's engineer. You did your training in a shipyard, learning about ship's engines as they were built. And that's what she'd done. And she was able to go from that to get her very first job as an extremely junior engineering assistant, engineering officer's assistant, on the blue funnel line, the Anchises, which is the picture in the top left-hand corner. Now, she had a great deal of difficulty in the 1920s, as you might imagine, with prejudice against the whole idea of a woman at sea. And although she was able, with some difficulty, to pass her second engineer's certificate, Board of Trade Examiners, they absolutely wouldn't allow her to pass her chief engineer's certificate. And it said that she attended the examination centres of the Board of Trade to take a chief engineer certificate over 30 times. And it got so embarrassing that the Board of Trade Examiners themselves would let other potential candidates, male candidates, know that she was presenting for her exam that day so that nobody else would attend, so that they couldn't be accused of failing a woman just for being a woman, because she would that day be the only person attending. Eventually, she got a chief engineer's certificate from Panama, where the examinations were all anonymous and nobody knew who she was. She was able to pass perfectly straightforwardly. She rose to become a chief engineer, working almost entirely for the rest of her career in Palestinian and Panamanian registered ships. And in the Second World War, she was working mainly for a company called Palestine Maritime Lloyd. But in 1940, she found herself as engineer on the Bonita, which is this picture on the bottom left, which was a Panamanian registered ship. And because it was Panamanian, it wasn't entitled to convoy cover when crossing the Atlantic. And so it was sailing independently, and it was attacked by the Luftwaffe, and quite badly attacked. And she sent all the rest of the crew out of the engine room, and she nursed that ship so that it achieved 4 knots, that's 4 extra miles an hour over its normal speed, so that they could dodge away from the Luftwaffe and get across the Atlantic safely. When they arrived in America, there was a colossal media interest in her because the story had got out about her bravery in running the engine room under fire. And she was awarded the MBE and the Lloyd's Bravery at Sea Medal for her bravery in that action. She continued to sail as chief engineer on various non-British flagged ships until she retired in 1962. So she's an example of a woman who became a very successful ship's engineer through some considerable difficulty, partly due to times in which she was serving, partly due to, of course, being a woman in a man's world. So here we are with Dorothy Pullinger. Dorothy Pullinger, almost the exact same age as Victoria Drummond, from a very different background. Victoria Drummond was from an aristocratic Scottish family. Dorothy Pullinger was the oldest child of this man in the picture with her father, Thomas Pullinger, who was a London lad who had managed to educate himself entirely by his own efforts, from being somebody who built bicycles commercially to working with some of the very earliest car designers in France. And she was, in fact, born in France while he was working for a succession of some of the earliest car designers there. By the time she was going to school, they were living in the English Midlands while her father was working at Humber and Sunbeam car factories. And by the time she was ready to leave school, he was running the Arrol Johnson factory in Paisley, which is the picture in the top right-hand corner. There's nothing left of that factory now, but it's on the Underwood Road in Paisley, and you can just see to the right of the chimney, you can see the Paisley Coates Observatory on top of the hill. So this was a rather decrepit old factory, and she had spent her whole life immersed in the early automobile industry because that was her father's work. And she persuaded him to let her become a trainee, an apprentice, if you like, in the drawing office at Arrol Johnson's. And one of the few pieces of work that we know she worked on was the Austro-Daimler aero engine, which you can see in the bottom right. And that's because Arrol Johnson had got a license from Austro-Daimler to build them in Britain. But all the drawings they were given were in metric, and she was given these drawings to redo with imperial measurements so that the workers at Arrol Johnson could make them. So by this time, World War I had started. And to begin with, they moved Arrol Johnson's to a brand new purpose-built factory near Dumfries, a place called Heathhall, and the building is still there. And they were building aero engines and whatever the government required for the war effort. In 1916, the company was overworked, had so much work they didn't have enough space. They built another factory, and that's the picture in the bottom left-hand picture, which is at Tongland. And this was built with the expressed intention that it should be not just a munitions factory, but the women munition workers, they would try to recruit women of a higher educational standard and give them training as an engineer. And it was advertised as being a university for lady engineers. So they got training, they did exams, and they could, I think the idea was that they hoped that after the war they could continue. That, of course, became much more difficult. While this was going on, Dorothy herself had been headhunted to go and be the lady superintendent in charge of several thousand women at the Vickers shell factory at Barrow-in-Furness. And she was there for the last 2 years of the war. After the war, she came back to the factory. Of course, they had to think, what are they going to do to for the factory to make a living after the end of munition work. And so many women had learnt to drive during the war that it was decided that they would, Dorothy and her father would design a car aimed at the female market. And this is the car, the Galloway Car. And the green one in the top right-hand picture is on display in the Glasgow Riverside Transport Museum right now. And it was built by the women who stayed on after the war, and it was advertised as a car built by ladies for others of their sex. But it was at least partly designed by Dorothy, so partly designed by a woman too. And the picture in the bottom left-hand corner is of Dorothy promoting the car at the Scottish Motor Show in the Kelvin Hall exhibition halls. The car was several thousand were built, of which about a dozen are left worldwide now. It was reasonably successful, but of course the Depression came along, and Galloway Cars, as part of Arrow Johnson, along with most of the other small Scottish car making companies, closed. And she moved to London, where she built her own steam laundry and went on to other things. So Molly Ferguson, who I mentioned before, she got a degree, a BSc honours degree in civil engineering in 1936, around the time when engineering degrees were labelled as such. And she went immediately to work initially as a what we would call a graduate trainee, as a pupil engineer for Blythe and Blythe. And she remained with them for her entire working life. In 1948, she became the UK's first woman senior partner in a civil engineering firm. And she designed things like bridges. This is the Bernera Bridge, a small bridge. And also a lot of industrial buildings. These pictures are of the Tullis Russell paperworks at Markage, now closed. But she did the industrial building design for those. In 1957, she became the first female fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And in 1978, she retired, although she continued to do consultancy. And she got an honorary doctorate, which you can see her in her doctorate robes there. And the consultancy work that she did in retirement, the money all went into a scholarship fund for women engineering students at Edinburgh University. She was very active in the Soroptimists and also in the Women's Engineering Society. And you'll see that she and Dorothy and Victoria all have this logo on their on these slides for the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame, because they are amongst the women who have been inducted into the Scottish Engineering Hall of Fame. Now we have somebody still with us, amazingly, Janet Harvey. And this is another woman with no education at all. In the Second World War, she was one of 4 women, only 4 women, recruited to be trained as shipyard electricians, fitting out the electrical systems in ships being built in the Clydeside shipyards in the Second World War. She worked at both John Brown's at Finniston and later at Harland and Wolff, and HMS Vanguard in the top right-hand picture. That was one of the ships she worked on. She's now very elderly, but very spry and active. You can see her there holding the hammer that she kept from her toolbox from her wartime years. And a couple of years ago, she was awarded an honorary doctorate at Glasgow Caledonian University, so she's now Dr. Janet Harvey. A Glasgow East End woman with no education is now an honorary doctor. And that was because we considered her such an amazing role model for engineers then and now. So coming more to the Kirkintilloch area, I thought you might be interested to see this piece of news report. Well, not new, it was a letter to the newspapers in 1919. And it referred to Beardmoores proof and testing ranges at Inchturf. Now, I'd never heard of these. But I was very interested because the letter mentioned that women had worked there during the war. It says this bit on the right-hand side, it's an extract from the letter. The first squad of men for the range was supplied from Dalmuir, one of Beardmore's big works, and consisted of about 9 men. At our busiest time, we employed between 30 and 40 men, women, and boys. The former doing the gun floor and heavy work of clearing the shot from the sand cells into which the guns are fired. The boys at the velocity screens, and the women in making up charges in the chronograph room and the office. Now, this will perhaps not mean very much to you unless you yourself have ever worked on a test range, but the screens and the chronograph are part of a piece of equipment that was widely used up until, well, the immediate post-Second War period. It was Victorian technology, but it had a really long lifespan. These were the sorts of guns that they were testing at that range. They were made mainly at Parkhead Forge. Women would have been involved in making components for the guns, and they were making things like howitzers and 6-inch diameter naval guns. And in fact, this picture in the bottom right-hand corner is the men and women of one of the howitzer shops. So I referred to screens and chronographs, and we have pictures from various eras of this equipment. So this sketch in the top left-hand corner is of what's known as the Bashforth chronograph, invented by the Reverend Bashforth in Victorian times. And it consists of a series, usually of about 10 very large screens with wires stretched across them, connected to the chronograph, which is this vertical equipment with pens moving across pieces of paper. The chronograph in this context means literally something that records time in a written way on a piece of paper. And the output is the time it takes for the shell shot from the gun to break the wires in each of these 10 screens. And that's recorded as spikes on the piece of paper. Piece of paper then is taken off the chronograph and is fitted into these frames that you can see in the picture in the top right-hand corner, which is actually from the Second World War, when this equipment was still being used in various places. And these women are taking the pieces of paper off the chronographs from the Shoebury Ness ranges and then measuring the timings of various projectiles that were under test. That's just to show you the kind of equipment that would have been used at Inchturf, and the sort of work that the women would have been working on would have been very similar to what you can see in that coloured picture, which I've labelled Shoebury Ness chronograph room. Bottom left is pictures from actually an advertising brochure when the Ministry of Defence was basically trying to get commercial contracts for its various test ranges. And this is a picture of women working at Inchturf up until the 1990s, when they were still employed at Inchturf ranges, making these very carefully measured out charges of explosives for the testing work. And in the right-hand corner, you can see the Inchturf, former Inchturf proof experimental range at, this is from a Google Earth image, and it was a quarry, and I think it's now a quarry again, just outside Kirkintilloch. It had its own railway line at the time, now gone, there are still some buildings left over from the 1990s when it closed as a range. So that draws to the end of some examples of women working in various aspects of engineering in Scotland. I was delighted to be asked to speak to the Kirkintilloch group because I was hoping there might be somebody still around who maybe worked at the Inchturf Proof and Experimental Establishment, maybe in the 80s or 90s, or perhaps knew somebody who did, maybe their family did, maybe even grandparents or great-grandparents worked at Inchturf in the Beardmoore days, in the period from about 1918 to the late 1920s. I would really love to hear from anybody with any information or recollections, especially relating to women who worked in Inchturf or indeed in other engineering activities. I have a blog, and you can find ways to contact me through that blog. Always pleased to hear from anybody with any information. Well, while I've been talking, the sun has set, which is why I'm now in pitch darkness. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed the talk.